Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong, and we have a great one today. So be sure to hit the like button as you come on. Today, we are going to focus back on West Asia and the Middle East. And to do that, I have a very special guest for you. Before we get to him, I wanted to first just introduce the live stream with a few words. So, when Governor John Winthrop celebrated in 1637 in what is now the state of Connecticut the English massacre of the Pequot indigenous tribe, he declared a day of thanks for the land and the riches from which he and the English colonists stole. Now, there was celebrations, feasts, drinks, and rejoicing over this victory. Israel in 2025 was hoping for the same kind of rejoicing in Gaza and the rest of the region, as its genocidal campaign was meant to not only expand throughout Palestinian territory, but to establish a greater Israel. Now, no such partying and rejoicing is happening. Actually, you have Israeli troops crying as they leave Gaza due to their immense defeat. And for all of the bluster of Trump and Netanyahu and the rest of the neocons, the axis of resistance, we've seen Iran more defiant than ever, and Israel is playing with fire in Lebanon as it violates the ceasefire thousands of times. Joining me now to discuss this and so much more is Professor Mohammad Marandi. Professor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me, Danny. Always a pleasure.
Great. Yes, Professor Marandi, first I wanted to get your reaction to this. So Israel is now retreating from Gaza after over a year of genocide. We saw 1 million perhaps Palestinians marching back to northern Gaza to their homes, which are mainly now just rubble. The Israeli media has highlighted IDF troops crying on their way out of Gaza as they've been forced back due to the ceasefire out of the Netzarim corridor. And there's been a lot made, Professor Marandi, about the embarrassment that Hamas and the Palestinian resistance are placing upon Israeli defense forces as they give up their prisoners of war in a manner that is believed to humiliate Israel. For example, giving up prisoners of war in front of the home, the destroyed home of Yahya Sinwar. Professor Marandi, what do you make of these developments? What does it tell us about the overall regional situation in Gaza and beyond?
If you recall, and I'm sure your viewers can check whenever they like, I've been saying that the Israeli regime will fail in Gaza and in Lebanon and in the Red Sea from the very beginning. And others like myself were saying this since October last year, meaning 15 months ago. The Israelis were bound to be defeated in Gaza, despite the horrific massacres and the genocide, the Holocaust. The Palestinians were determined from day one that they will hold their ground. And Hamas and its allies showed the Israelis that they are not the power that they were before. In the decades before the rise of the axis of resistance, whenever the Israelis wanted to invade a neighboring country, whether Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or Egypt, they would advance swiftly and take large amounts of land. They went all the way to Beirut, they took the West Bank, they took the Golan, and of course they went all the way across the Sinai very easily and very swiftly. But this time around in Gaza, they were stuck. And in Lebanon, we had the or we saw the most heavy fighting ever between the Israeli regime and a power outside of its borders. The battle in southern Lebanon on the border was very heavy. The fighting was extraordinarily heavy, but Hezbollah held its ground, and the Israeli regime was unable to take a single city, even a small city or a large town. It failed completely. And while many were martyred in Gaza and in Lebanon, and civilians were slaughtered, and resistance fighters on both to the south and the north were martyred, but the Israelis failed. And we also saw in the Red Sea for over 15 months, the Americans tried to crush the resistance there too, so that the Israelis could use the Red Sea to strengthen their economy, to carry out the genocide more easily. They failed. They failed across the board. This was all expected. The only thing that was unexpected was Syria. And Syria, as I said from the very beginning, was a tactical victory for Netanyahu, Erdogan, and Biden. But I think in the long run, actually, Syria is not going to end well for any of these actors, because Al Qaeda in Syria is not going to be able to control the country. We're already seeing it's the slaughter of people who they feel are a threat. We see that they're incapable of governing, and we also see that countries across the region and across Asia are wary, very wary of Al Qaeda. Uh, countries that like China, Russia, Central Asian countries, where many of these fighters come from, they're concerned, and they're concerned about what Mr. Erdogan is doing. And even countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan are concerned. Jolani is trying to strengthen relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis are worried because these extremists in Syria have ambitions that go beyond the borders of Syria, and many of them are far more extreme than Jolani, or at least today, Jolani today. Otherwise, Jolani was the deputy of ISIS. He was Abu Bakr Baghdadi's deputy. He killed thousands of people in car bombs across Iraq. But the Jolani today, he is going to have a very tough time dealing with the more extreme elements that have taken Damascus. And that, as I said, is a threat to the West, because the countries that are threatened by these extremist groups are in the Western camp. So I think this has been a major defeat for Israel. The last 16 months, been almost 16 months now, have been disastrous. And the most important element of all is that the regime has been delegitimized in the eyes of the global majority. Even in the West, even in the United States, you see people like Tucker Carlson saying things that were not said before, or Candace Owens. These are people on the right, and among other groups in American civil society, we see huge opposition toward Zionism and the regime itself. And therefore, I think that is the most devastating aspect of this conflict, the fact that they have not just the Israeli regime, but the collective West. It has destroyed its image across the world because they've been partner to this genocide. So it is understandable for these Israeli soldiers to weep and cry because they've invested so much in this genocide, and ultimately they've been forced to pull out. That doesn't mean the war is over, because it is quite possible that the ceasefire will collapse. We have to see what Netanyahu does. We'll have to see where Trump takes this. But if the ceasefire moves forward, it is a catastrophic defeat for the regime. And if they continue with the genocide, I think the defeat will be even more catastrophic, because the world is now witnessing these soldiers being released the images are very bad for Israel. Seeing these women soldiers well fed, these all of the Israelis well fed, well taken care of. It again rips apart the narrative of the West and the Israeli regime, Western media, Western governments, Western think tanks, Western journalists. Their narrative has been ripped apart, and then of course they don't show the thousands of Palestinians who are being released, the women and the children, many of them who were uh, just taken hostage and never charged. But we see how many of them were battered, how many of them have broken teeth, and many of them are suffering from malnutrition. Uh, this has been catastrophic for the regime. And if the genocide resumes, I think the world will be much more angry than even it has been over the past few months.
Yeah, and there have been just devastating reports, Professor Marandi. Israeli media have taken polls where only 4% of Israelis themselves believe that the objectives in Gaza that Israel set forth for itself have been accomplished. There's also, as you said, Syria reports now that so-called pro-Assad forces have begun operations against Israel. And uh, it seems like these ceasefires, both in Gaza and Lebanon, are hanging on by a thread. And that one of the big things to watch is phase two, when the Palestinian resistance begins to give prisoners of war of male Israeli soldiers, and how much that's going to cause. It's already Israel, it seems like the regime is breaking down. The political situation is so on fire. The most extreme elements, Ben Gavir and others saying, Smotrich, this is a huge defeat. It only gets worse the more and more that these prisoners of war, it seems like, are released, to the point where the media, Professor Baradi, is telling us that this is a huge embarrassment, and Israel is not taking it very well, meaning that the fighting could resume. But Palestinians have already proven, and the axis of resistance, that that fighting is only going to go so far. What do you say?
Well, in Syria, I don't think that these are pro-Assad forces. I think actually we are seeing the rise of new forces in Syria. And I think that's good for Syria because the Ba'athist party of Assad obviously was very corrupt. And while the resistance, the axis of resistance, defended the Syrian government, they were defending it against something that was much worse, and that was ISIS and Al Qaeda, against the very same people who have taken over the country today. Otherwise, it's not as if their previous government was uh, a government that was ideal for the Syrian people. But we do see this. We also saw an attack on Israeli regime positions in Syria by a resistance organization. So we're seeing things begin to happen in Syria, and also, it's not just the withdrawal of the Israelis. We saw the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians move to the north, and then we saw people power in Lebanon move to the south. And because at the end of the ceasefire, where the Israeli regime was supposed to withdraw, as expected, they didn't. And so the Lebanese mobilized supporters of the resistance, Christian, Muslim, Shia, Sunni, Druze, people who supported the resistance from all over Lebanon went to the south and went to their villages. And the Israeli regime was so disgusting that they gunned down ordinary people, including 6 women. But some very iconic images came out of that. There was a woman standing beside a tank and unafraid, and there was another woman who was being shot at by Israelis, and she stood her ground and told them to go back to their home countries. So it was, in a sense, it was a revolution or people power led by women of the resistance. So these I think were two powerful blows to the regime. And if the regime does choose to end the ceasefire and begin the genocide again, it's going to be much more difficult because Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah have been preparing themselves. They've also had a huge morale boost because people in Gaza have come and seen their power, their capabilities. The world has seen the narrative of the Israeli regime collapse, and Yemen is prepared to fire more missiles. And remember, Iran will ultimately punish if the fighting goes on. Iran will retaliate against the Israeli regime at some point. There's no doubt about that. I know some people have been saying, why hasn't Iran struck the regime? But as I said before, there were two elements. One was the fact that when Syria fell, and since Syrian airspace became more easily accessible to the Israeli regime, the Iranians had to recalculate how to set up air defenses to make sure the country is protected. And then we had the secret negotiations that were beginning in order to revive the ceasefire after Trump's victory. And the Iranians did not want that to be sabotaged. So during the, I think, 40 days roughly of negotiations, which Iran was deeply involved with because Iran and Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad and Ansarullah, they're in constant communication with one another. During that period, Iran was cautious not to allow the Israeli regime to have an excuse to refrain from establishing a ceasefire. But Israel right now is much more vulnerable than before. And as I said, the world is sick and tired of this genocide. Everyone's people are disgusted, but to restart this genocide after this defeat is going to be much more difficult. And also, since they've withdrawn from Gaza or most of Gaza right now, it's going to be they're going to go and have to fight. They're going to have to fight again to retake those territories. And in Lebanon, although they never really made any inroads, what they did was that after the ceasefire, they started taking territory. That's how untrustworthy this regime is. So they would go into towns and villages that they'd never been able to take during the war, and they would go in there and start burning down people's homes and the mosques and the shops, and they've been destroying village after village alongside the border. That's how despicable these people are. But people have, as I said, over the last few days, they've used people power and they've pushed them out of most of these territories. If the regime initiates another conflict, it's not going to go well for it. It's going to be much worse than before. And I don't think that it's going to look good for Trump, because Trump was showing this as a sign of his success in that he was able to bring about a ceasefire even before he came into office. And even though he's said the ceasefire may not hold, but it won't look good for him if his allies and if his genocidal allies in Tel Aviv initiated something where the world would see as just another excuse to bring about further genocide.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought all of this up in terms of the violations and the continued attempts by the Israeli regime to intimidate and even kill Lebanese and Palestinians throughout this period. Because, as you were talking, Professor Marandi, and you put out the idea that this could happen again, Israel could be regrouping. Indeed, that is true. But one thing that I think this moment has showed is that not only does Israel have to do everything you said with regard to Gaza, that they're going to have to reignite their genocidal campaign to try to take back territories that they never actually took in the first place, but they're also going to have to deal with the resistance, because Abu Ubaidah, the spokesperson for Hamas, said after the ceasefire that Iran, Hezbollah, Ansarallah, and the Iraqi resistance, and I don't know if I'm forgetting anyone, Professor Brandi, are all part of the reason why this ceasefire came about. Talk about how this factors into the equation of what Israel is able to do from here, given that they had October, February, January, what is this, 15 months to accomplish their objectives, and they didn't, and the resistance is still right there, as Abu Ubaidah proclaimed. So your thoughts?
Yes, he gave special thanks to Hezbollah, and I think it is well deserved. Hezbollah, the people of Gaza and the resistance, Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and the others, they were fighting for their survival. But Hezbollah willingly sacrificed their members, their soldiers, their leaders to protect the people of Gaza, to draw away much of the Israeli regime forces. And in fact, during the 2 months of very heavy fighting between the regime and Hezbollah, that fighting, as I said earlier, was the most intense, not of just this war, but of all the wars that the regime has fought in its history. And Hezbollah held its ground. So it gave large numbers of martyrs among civilians and among supporters of the resistance and among the resistance itself, for the sake of another people, for the sake of the people of Palestine, for the people of Gaza in particular. And in addition to that, Ansarullah, they did the same. They made sacrifices. They were constantly being bombed by the Americans and their sidekick in London, and also the Israelis, because they were implementing the Genocide Convention in the Red Sea, blocking ships from going to Israeli ports. And this is the same Ansarullah that survived 7 years of genocide itself, a genocide where the Saudis and the Emiratis, with the support of Qatar, with the support of Turkey, all of these countries were supporting the genocide in Yemen, along with NATO countries. They were all behind. Ansarullah was very much alone. Only later on, when there was a split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and we saw that the Saudis and the Emiratis besieged Qatar, did Turkey and Qatar move away from Saudi Arabia. But so Yemen, which had survived 7 years of genocide, they were willing to make even more sacrifices for the sake of the people of Gaza. So he gave them special thanks alongside the resistance in Iraq and, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran. But he also thanked Jordanian citizens who went into, on their own, at their own initiative, not the government had nothing to do with it, into the West Bank and carried out operations against the Israeli regime, and they were all killed and they were all martyred fighting. There were, I think, 2 or 3 attacks, if I'm not mistaken. Your viewers could correct me if I'm wrong. So if there is a revival, there's no doubt that as we speak, the Iranians continue to support Gaza. They will get new supplies. It's been going on throughout this period through the means that they have, which I have no idea how it works. And the same is happening in Lebanon. The same is happening in Yemen. They're all preparing themselves for the next phase. But it's going to be very costly for the regime if it revives this war. Again, the big, as I said, all the areas that they've withdrawn from in Gaza, the resistance is preparing those territories for the future. So if they want to fight again, they'll have to retake all those territories. And but alongside that, the international community is going to be disgusted because they're saying, well, this is over now. Why are you seeking further trouble? They're releasing your prisoners. And it was very interesting, very smart move by the resistance to have these women, most of these women, wear their uniforms to remind the world that these weren't just a bunch of teenagers or young women that were taken. These were soldiers of the Israeli armed forces.
Yeah, yes, indeed, Professor Marandi. Now, we'll definitely get back to the resistance in a moment. However, I did want to pivot to Iran because while Trump has been very vocal on Gaza, saying that the ceasefire, he's not very confident in it holding, even made mention of moving Palestinians, displacing them, cleansing them to Egypt and Jordan. He said he hasn't said so much about Iran other than a deal. Now, Iran's foreign minister has said that, in very clear terms, that if there's any, first of all, not very confident in a deal happening, but if there's any threats which have been made over the last several months, both by Israel and Washington, of strikes on Iran's nuclear site, that Iran is going to hit very, 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 very hard. So, Professor Marandi, why would Iran make this statement now, given that many people have written off Iran as not being forthright enough and perhaps even being hurt by Israel's last strike back in late October? Um, why then is Iran speaking this defiantly when Trump is talking about a possible deal and um, um, there's not a lot of activity around um, Iran itself right now. Not a lot of talk so much.
Well, actually, that's a good point. If the Iranian defenses were weakened the way in which the Americans like to claim and the Israeli regime like to claim, does anyone really think that Netanyahu and the Americans would refrain from striking Iran? Of course not. They would use that opportunity to strike again and again and again. If Iran did not have adequate defenses, and if it did not have adequate offensive capabilities, they would never refrain from attacking. So I think that's pretty clear. And again, as I said, the Iranians, we all recall how Iran struck Israel with almost 200 missiles. They almost all went through their defenses. And if the United States makes a foolish move, the Iranians will strike very hard. And it's very simple for Iran to be very blunt. These small, tiny Arab dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, which host U.S. bases, if anything happens, they will no longer be exporting oil or gas, and that would bring the global energy markets. That would bring about that would create chaos. The price of oil would go up to maybe $300-$400 a barrel. That would lead to a global economic depression. And so all of those oil and gas facilities in the Persian Gulf, all of those tankers are easily destroyed. It's a very small. If anyone looks at the Persian Gulf, it's narrow and long, and so everything is very vulnerable. If the Americans could not defeat Ansarullah in the Red Sea after 15, 16 months, then there's not a chance in the world that they're going to be able to defeat the Iranians, especially since the Iranians have been preparing themselves for such a day, for such a possibility for decades. And just today, the Iranians have shown that they have another underground missile base. So the Iranians have these missile bases across the world, across the country, across the Persian Gulf, and I think the Americans recognize that. So the Iranians, I think it is a show of force, and we've seen that over the past few weeks, the Iranians have been carrying out extensive maneuvers. It is a show of strength, both to telling the Trump and his people that any mistake in this region would be fatal for the global economy. It would be fatal for the U.S. economy. No one would win.
Yeah, indeed. And Professor Marandi, though, it seems like the Western media is actually right now in the throes of an effort to promote increasing escalations on Iran, which may have prompted Agachi, the foreign minister of Iran, to make these comments about how an all-out war would occur if its nuclear sites are hit by the United States and or Israel? Because at the moment, you just look at the headlines. There's rumors about an 1,800-mile radius nuclear site producing nuclear weapons that can reach Europe. There's also a lot of talk about how to prevent Iran from producing nuclear weapons. Uh, is the United States and Israel right now gearing up as they regroup from this embarrassment that just happened in Gaza? Are they gearing up to try to provoke and maybe escalate with Iran as the Trump administration moves forward, Professor Marandi?
Well, this news about Iran developing a nuclear weapon, that's all fake news. That's the sort of fake news that you're going to see from the Western media whenever the West wants to put pressure on some adversary. We saw that in the Iraq War. When they invaded Iraq, they lied about chemical weapons, they lied about nuclear weapons, they lied about Al Qaeda. We saw them lie their way into Libya. That we saw them, just uh, in the dirty war in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard has exposed a lot of the reality of what happened during the when she was in the testifying, or when she was trying to get her confirmation in the confirmation hearing. She exposed the fact that what we've been saying all along, that this was a dirty war, that that the chemical weapon, the claims that President Assad used chemical weapons or the Syrian government used chemical weapons was a lie. All of these things that we've been saying for 13 years, and the Western media has been just repeating because that's what their masters have been telling them to do. All of them have been exposed. So these are just new lies that Western media is putting out because they have a vested interest in these or those people behind the media, they have a vested interest in intensifying tensions. And without a doubt, the Israelis would like to see a war. They would be more than willing to sacrifice the United States or the Europeans or the global economy for their own selfish interests. They never cared about the West. They've destroyed the image and the credibility of the West by carrying out this Holocaust for the last 15, 16 months. The West has paid the price in the sense that they have no credibility across the world. The world sees the West as barbaric and inhumane, the Western elites and the regimes that are in power. So Israel, is more than willing to sacrifice everyone for itself. But the United States does recognize Iran's power. Remember, when the United States took Iraq, when they took Afghanistan, they had literally surrounded Iran. And Iran back then was much weaker. Iran back then was much weaker than it is today. And even then, the United States did not dare attack Iran. So the country was surrounded. Iran was in a much more vulnerable position. The United States was at the height of its power. It was the global hyperpower. But it didn't attack Iran because they knew it wasn't a war they could win. Everyone would lose. Today, Iran is much more powerful, and the United States is relatively weaker. They've been losing war after war, spending countless trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and elsewhere, and now in Ukraine. So this is not a war that the Americans can fight against Iran and win.
Yeah, indeed. And, as you were talking, Professor Marandi, it reminded me that, there's been more than a few people who've been very critical of Iran, even those who supported Palestine and the axis of resistance as a whole, about the slowness of their response and even about their potential, the leadership under Pezeshkian, wanting to negotiate with the United States around a potential nuclear deal, sanctions, etc. Some even accusing Iran of liberalizing, going that far. But so far, the Iranian government appears to have taken a posture of there's really no possibility of talks at the moment with the United States, given what the U.S. is currently offering and how it's currently behaving. what have you made of this in terms of the overall posture of Iran toward the U.S. as the Trump administration has entered, and this talk about Iran's defiance and resistance toward the U.S. and Israeli regime versus its willingness to negotiate?
Well, if we go back to 2015 during the nuclear negotiations, even though I believe that the nuclear deal was pretty flawed and that it could have been better negotiated, and that the Rouhani administration put the negotiators in a very bad position for a host of reasons which I don't want to get into right now. But even back then, when Iran was weaker than today and the United States was stronger, uh, the United States and Iran, when they signed the deal, it had nothing to do with Iran, the axis of resistance. Iran's support for Hezbollah had nothing to do with the deal. Iran's support for the popular mobilization forces in Iraq had nothing to do with the nuclear deal. Iran's support for Ansarullah, or what the West likes to call the Houthis in Yemen and the Yemeni government, was not a part of any deal. So even if at some point the Iranians do negotiate with the Americans, that has nothing to do with Iran's support for the axis of resistance. I find it very strange that some people say that Iran is using the axis of resistance in order to strike a deal with the Americans. Well, if Iran didn't have the axis, if Iran didn't support the axis of resistance in the first place, if it did not create the axis of resistance in the first place, it wouldn't have a problem with the United States to have the need for some sort of deal today. Iran has been living with maximum pressure sanctions for 15 years now, or even more. And we've had sanctions since the beginning of the revolution. So since the beginning of the revolution, we had sanctions, and they just increased year after year. And Iran has been supporting these groups, funding these groups, so they paid a heavy price for the axis of resistance. So that's nonsense. And these claims made against Iran are usually made by people who do nothing for the resistance themselves. At most, they fire off a few tweets, but they don't do anything. They don't force their governments to change their stance. All the governments in the region, or at least most of them, are collaborating with the Israelis. Turkey, the Turkish government is doing business as usual, sending oil from Baku. Baku has just signed a deal with the Israeli regime to buy 10% of a an investment in a gas field in the Mediterranean. Egypt is doing business with the Israelis. So is Jordan. So is the Emirates. So, those people who are making these claims against Iran, I think what they're basically doing is they're trying to whitewash, or they're trying to muddy the water so that people don't look at what their own governments have been doing and what the governments that they've been supporting have been doing. They're trying to whitewash these regimes. So Iran will continue. I mean, I don't know if there's going to be negotiations between Iran and the United States. Iran will be much tougher with the United States than it was in 2015, because we saw how the United States violated its commitments back then. And it's not just with Iran. The Minsk Accords is a similar experience. The Americans and the Europeans, in general, they are unreliable. We saw how the former German Chancellor Merkel admitted that they had never intended to abide by the Minsk Accords. We saw Hollande say the same thing soon afterwards, and then the former president of Ukraine. This is how the West deals with the rest of the world. So if there are negotiations at some point, and right now the Iranians are being very tough. You can see, as you rightly pointed out, what the interview that the foreign minister made shows that the Iranians are not going to be giving any unnecessary concessions to anyone. At this stage, I think that nothing is really happening between Iran and the United States. If at some point the Americans decide to be sane and put a very reasonable offer to the Iranians, then it's possible that there will be negotiations. But as I said, that has nothing to do with the axis of resistance, just as it never had anything to do with the axis of resistance in the past. And one final point is that if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, Iran would have had it a long time ago. Iran is today, thanks to Trump, one of the 10 most advanced countries in nuclear energy. One of the 10 most advanced countries in the world. So Iran could develop a nuclear weapon whenever it wants. And we know how Iranian drone and missile technology, how advanced that is, and how developed Iran is in that regard. It's very simple for Iran. The point is that the Iranians never wanted a nuclear weapon because nuclear weapons are horrible for the world. And not only would they cause instability because then other countries would want them, but also Iran just doesn't like these sort of weapons. I think it's very difficult for some people in the West to comprehend that the Islamic Republic of Iran is much more humane than Western regimes. And let me give you an example. During the 1980s, when the West was giving Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against Iran, and I survived two chemical attacks, one mustard gas attack in 1988 and one nerve agent in 1984 during the Khaybar operation. The Iranian commanders and leaders went to the leader back then and said we should develop chemical weapons, just like Saddam Hussein. And he said no. He said no, we are not going to develop and use chemical weapons. So Iran paid a price. And Western countries not only gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons, they banned Iran, they prevented other countries from selling Iran gas masks. They prevented Iran from obtaining the materials to defend themselves from chemical weapons. That is how Western regimes behave. And that's how Iran behaved. And today, those same regimes are supporting genocide in Gaza, and Iran is the lone country, alongside Yemen, of course, that is standing against the genocide. So whenever Westerners try to, Western elites and think tanks and media, when they talk about human rights in Iran, I always find it ridiculous because I've survived chemical attacks. I couldn't breathe because of chemical attacks. I lived through chemical attacks. I'll never believe any Western media outlet that pretends that they care about human dignity and human rights. So when the Iranians say that they don't want nuclear weapons because it is immoral and it kills innocent people, they're very serious, and history has shown that they're consistent. However, the Iranians have said that if there's an existential threat to the country, then they will change their nuclear posture. They've been very explicit about that, which is understandable. So that's not where Iran wants to go. And Americans, if they're foolish enough, then Iran will be forced to change its position.
And it's an extraordinary position, Professor Marandi, given the dirty little secret of the fact that Israel is in possession of nuclear weapons, and that Israel has shown through its behavior in the region that it is willing to go to great lengths militarily to get what it wants, to the point of now what we witness is genocide. So it's an extraordinary position for Iran. And if you could comment on that, on the fact that the biggest players, Israel and of course the United States too, both are nuclear powers with nuclear weapons. And both, while Israel hasn't necessarily used one that we know of, the United States has. And Israel has a long record of absolute aggression in the region, which obviously has Iran on very high alert. Your thoughts?
Well, the Iranian nuclear program, the peaceful nuclear program, is very well protected because the United States is a lawless regime, because the Europeans are lawless regimes. They've constantly threatened Iran with military strikes over the years. All options are on the table. The West can threaten countries whenever they like because for them, international law means nothing. For them, the international law is for the others, it's for the non-Western governments. They have to abide by commitments, they have to abide by the international law. The nuclear deal with Iran was a good example. Obama, from day one, began to violate the deal, but the Iranians were forced to abide by their commitments. Of course, in future, that's not going to happen. Iran won't accept that sort of deal. But the point is that the West sees itself as above the law. They see themselves as exceptional. American exceptionalism is basically that very same thing. They see themselves as having more rights than others, more privileges than others. And that's why the Iranians have been forced to protect their nuclear program and build it very, very deep underground so that if the Americans or the Israelis or anyone else tries to bomb it, they will fail to destroy it. So that, and of course, Iran has extensive air defenses around it too. So uh, the smart, and as you pointed out, that not only have the Americans used chemical weapons, but the Israeli regime is a genocidal regime. And this genocidal regime has already had senior government officials threaten and people with nuclear weapons. We saw a minister in the Israeli cabinet speak about using a nuclear weapon in Gaza at the beginning of the genocide. And on numerous occasions, Netanyahu, this genocidal monster, went to where they have their nuclear program and made threats against Iran from there, basically implying that the Israeli regime can use nuclear weapons. So I think Iran is in a position, is being very smart. They have the capability, and that itself is deterrence. It's a threshold state, but they don't want the bomb. And as I said, if they wanted it, they would have had it a long time ago. And there's nothing that the Americans could have done about it. And there's nothing they can do about it today. And that, I think, the smartest thing is to do one's best to prevent nuclear war, because that would bring about the end of humanity. If there's a nuclear exchange anywhere in this world, that will have huge consequences. And of course, if it's between the Americans and the Chinese and the Russians, that would bring an end to everything. But a nuclear war, whether between India and Pakistan or in our region, that will have consequences for the entire globe that will be irreversible.
Yeah. Yeah. And perhaps now we can pivot back to the overall global situation, Professor Marandi, because uh, it seems, there are many elements to this. We have, of course, Israel's significant defeat in Gaza alone on the military front, the axis of resistance, the regional forces in solidarity with Palestine playing a huge role in creating the conditions for this ceasefire. And you also have a broader trend of a multipolar world emerging where Iran is a big player in this. But the regional situation in West Asia, Palestine and beyond, is going to play a big role in the success of this multipolar world. So my question to you is this, Professor Marandi. We are witnessing these seismic changes right now. And I've heard a lot of people make the comparison of what's happening to Palestine, what's happening in the region, as almost like Israel's Vietnam moment. And I see some parallels, not only in the fact that we just saw the resistance make a huge pushback against a genocidal military campaign, but also there's a changing world, because the Vietnam War also happened in a very rapidly changing world. It was the tide of communism, the specter of communism that the United States during the Cold War was so trying to defeat, destroy Soviet Union, destroy China, destroy any country that decided they wanted to be independent. Now I see kind of something similar here, and so I wanted to ask you, where do you see the future of West Asia um, in this context of multipolarity, as we know that this, of course, isn't over, but that this Vietnam moment for Israel and its Washington backers seems to be more and more of a relevant comparison. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's actually a good example. In the Vietnam War, I don't remember the numbers of American soldiers who were killed, but I think they were like between 50 and 60,000, if I'm not mistaken. But the number of Vietnamese who were murdered were above 1 million, maybe in the millions. But who won the war and who lost the war? The Americans had to withdraw. So it doesn't matter if the Israeli regime slaughters innocent people across Gaza. It matters. I mean, it's barbaric and inhumane, but it actually does not help their cause. It makes things worse for them. It turns the world against the Israeli regime, just as the world turned against the Americans in Vietnam. Across the globe, people were protesting against the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, including inside the United States itself. So this has been a devastating defeat for the regime. And ultimately, like the United States, they're going to have to leave. They're going to go back home, these colonizers. They've destroyed their country. It's not just that they've destroyed the economy. It's not just that they've been defeated on the battlefield in the Red Sea, in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, and in the future in Syria. But also, more importantly, their credibility and image has been demolished across the world. People look at, and if someone holds an Israeli passport and travels, people will look at them with disgust. People will not want to interact with them. That is going to have a huge impact in the future. So I don't think that the regime will last very long. And the fact is that the United States and the Europeans that have been the real reason why the regime exists, they are on the decline, on the relative decline. Europe is declining much faster than the United States. And the rest of the world, which is very much outraged by these atrocities, they're on the rise. So the Israeli regime, as we've seen over the past 16 months, is completely dependent on the United States and the West. It's not an independent regime. The West has to send weapons 24 hours a day to help it slaughter women and children, and it still was unable to win. So the regime has declined. The West is in decline, relative decline. This is not going to end well. And also our regime, our region has regimes that are in the Western camp that are very vulnerable. People in this region forget, Iran and the axis of resistance aside, people across the region know that their governments have done nothing but help the Israeli regime. Even those who pretend to be pro-Palestinian, like Erdogan, who every now and then makes a speech or has a demonstration, holds a demonstration against Israel, he's doing all sorts. He's fueling the genocide. It's the oil that he sends to Israel that helps with it. Even after Netanyahu was declared a war criminal and an arrest warrant was given, he continued to do business with it. So all of these people, all of these governments have been exposed, and people across the region will be more demanding of their governments in the future. This region is not very stable. We have to remember what happened in Tunisia. Some young man in a decade and a half ago set himself alight on the streets in protest, and the government in Egypt collapsed, let alone the government in Tunisia. So anything can happen in this region, and the more the Europeans and the Americans push for death and slaughter, the more chance there is that regimes in the Western camp can be destabilized, especially now that you have these terrorists in power in Syria. They could also be a factor in creating instability. So these Western regimes should be very careful for what they wish for.
Yeah, and I want to throw this out there, Professor Marandi. The French colonized Vietnam, and over a span of about 100 years before the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, they were ousted, and then the United States immediately came in first on a more covert basis, and then, of course, the direct intervention. And that means that over a century, we're talking about roughly 130 or so years, Vietnam was under the scourge of occupation and foreign intervention. Israel is not that old, and yet Israel and its Washington backers are seeing all of these setbacks, and they're accelerating. So, you know, we're talking about another, for it to get even comparatively to the Vietnam situation, we would have to look at another 30, 40 plus years. Professor Marandi, does Israel have this much time if it continues along this path? Because even as the ceasefire in Gaza hangs on by a threadbare, the same with Lebanon, there is no indications that the Israeli regime has any kind of stop button. Uh, uh, and it's very likely that there's going to be a reigniting of the war of resistance there against it.
Yes, I don't think that this is the last war, unfortunately. And I think that more people will sadly die because of the Western insistence to impose racism on the people of our region. The West insists on supporting ethno-supremacism. They insist on ethnic cleansing, and they insist on genocide and slaughter. That's what Western regimes have been doing in Palestine for a very long time, and they've intensified it more recently. But this will not end well for them. I think this is the beginning of the end of the Israeli regime. I think that significant numbers will, a significant number has already left, and more will leave in future because the regime will no longer be, it will no longer thrive. No major business would be stupid enough to invest in Palestine anymore because they know that if something happens, all of those investments can just disappear. And therefore, I I don't see this lasting much longer. I'm not saying it will, that the regime will collapse next month or next year, but I think we are witnessing the beginning of the end. And as you point out, history is not, it's not a matter of days and weeks. Things can play out very slowly, but for us at least. But for a historian who looks back in history, these are very brief moments. But in any case, I'm confident that ultimately apartheid in Palestine will be defeated, and we already see that there has been a sea change across the world. Most people across the world seem to be ignorant about Palestine. They just saw Israel as a country and the Palestinian issue as a small conflict between two people over land. Over the past 15, 16 months, people have been learning about history. They've learned about the Nikba. They've been seeing the nature of Zionism, what Zionism actually means, and the racism and the evil that lies behind it. And even in the United States, you've seen, as I said earlier, a sea change among public opinion and among and people of influence. And we've seen, many young Jews being at the forefront of the opposition to Zionism. We saw Max Blumenthal just recently humiliate the the former Secretary of State, and also uh, we saw Sam Hosseini, who a Christian, humiliate him as well. We see many other Jews and Muslims working together, the electronic intifada. We see many people, many of them active. The world has changed, and people from all walks of life, from different religious and ethnic and racial backgrounds, are standing up against the regime, despite the fact that Western media and social media, they're all, we are. I've been removed from Facebook. I've been removed from Instagram, and it's very clear to me that my Twitter account or my X account is heavily shadow banned. Uh, for the last 6 months, I haven't had any more new followers, which is fine. But the point is that despite all that, despite the ban on TikTok and how TikTok is now being so oppressive, but the world has changed, and these regimes are just showing themselves to be intolerant and despotic and authoritarian, uh, and being exactly what they claim others to be. other countries to be and other governments to be. So they're only making things worse for themselves. So I'm optimistic about the future, although I'm not naive. I think we have, dark days and months and perhaps years ahead. But as I've said before, I do see light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you, Professor Marandi, your reaction to Trump's proposal that, or what he has been suggesting all over social media and to the media in general, that he's going to essentially wage an economic war, this time a tariffs war, not so much a sanctions war. But we know that sanctions have also been threatened on Russia, for example, and they're not being let up on any country, including Iran, yet. But uh, he is saying BRICS, 100% tariffs are coming their way should they pursue de-dollarization. Iran is a member of BRICS. And so I wanted to ask you about this in the context of also the Trump administration, while essentially being a big part of this brokering of the ceasefire, at least in terms of the U.S. government's role in it. At the same time, he has been very clear that he is against the resistance. We saw that Yemen, the Ansar Allah movement, went right on the terrorist list. We also know that he is trying to revoke any immigration status from those who may not be citizens fully in the United States, should they stand up in solidarity with the resistance and with Palestine. So I'm curious on your thoughts about this Trump regime that's come in, Professor Marty, and what it means for the axis of resistance, because right now it's quite clear that this ceasefire is a feather in his cap. But on the other hand, this is the United States and this is the Trump administration. And so what do you believe is to come from this? How do you see this transpiring over the days, months ahead in this administration?
Well, if he wants to preserve this feather in his cap, as you say, then he has to preserve the ceasefire. But when it comes to uh, tariffs, I don't think countries like Iran and Russia really care because we are already sanctioned, so it's not going to have a direct impact on us. But I also think he completely misunderstands what uh, BRICS is doing. BRICS is because he was speaking about imposing 100% tariffs if they create a currency. BRICS is not trying to create a new currency. That's not on the agenda. That never was. They are developing mechanisms where these countries can trade without using the US dollar. They don't need an alternative currency. Right now, for example, the Iranians and the Russians are using their own currencies. And the same is true with Iran and China and Russia and China. So, and this is going to expand because this is convenient to many countries. And it's with the new technologies, it's not that difficult anymore. We're in a changing world. So countries that neighbor one another, they can start increasingly use their own currencies and find ways to do that. So what BRICS is doing is not something that Trump can stop. And if he wants to impose 100% tariffs for something that's not about to happen, fine. But there is no currency out there for him to be worried about. What is happening is that the nations themselves are finding means to do business without using the US dollar. And that's going to cause a lot of trouble for the United States. The less demand there is for the US dollar in the future, uh, the more problematic things are going to be for Trump. And I, again, I'm not an economist, but again, I think that the United States policy under Trump is just as bad as the previous administrations, but it will hurt the United States in a different way. By targeting uh, Canada, ordinary Canadians are good people, I'm sure, but the Canadian regime has hurt our region. They've been a sidekick for the United States for decades in our region, and they've been a part of the problem. Justin Trudeau has just as much blood on his hands. He's just as much a monster as Netanyahu. The same is true with the Chancellor of Germany and the Prime Minister of the UK and the President of France. These are all genocidal monsters. History will remember them for who they are and what they've done. So for the United States to punish these countries, the Europeans or the Canadians, I feel differently about Mexico, but it's these regimes, they deserve it, and they deserve and I don't think it's going to go well for the United States either. If the Canadians resist, if the Europeans resist, it's going to create inflation in the United States, and Trump has promised to bring down inflation. He has lots of trouble ahead, and with or without tariffs, the United States is in a lot of trouble. The global economy, a lot of people are saying it's on the verge of a catastrophe, and then we may witness something like the depression that we saw after 1929, and some say it could be even worse. So I think the world is going to have. I think the 2025 is going to be a very difficult year, but I think what Trump is doing is probably going to make it worse.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe we can close. We can see if there are any questions afterward to close. But um, on what you believe Iran's role in this will be in terms of this transition to a multipolar world, because I see this landscape, Professor Marandi. Israeli media is talking about the resistance, which of course Iran is seen, and you rightly point out, as a big supporter of the resistance. Well, all of the resistance that Iran supports, they're all rising in status and prestige. Even Israeli media has to say Hamas, it's the sole governing authority, not just now of Gaza, but even of all of Palestine, as Israel turns to the West Bank and faces a similar kind of resistance to it. But then, Yemen, Hezbollah, and Lebanon, we can go on and on and on, but it's the resistance to Israel and to U.S. domination that is the most popular, and Iran is the most powerful government leading this. So, what role do you find Iran will play in the multipolar world as it balances its support of the resistance, as this ongoing genocidal war has its ebbs and flows, and also its role as a big power with Russia and China to build a new world that spans into West Asia, but also well outside of it?
Well, we have to remember that just a few weeks ago, Western media and Western think tanks day and night were saying that Iran is severely weakened and that the axis of resistance has fallen apart. But right after that, and we've had this discussion before, and I said this is not true. And right after that, we saw the victory in Gaza. We saw people in Lebanon push out the Israeli regime. We see Yemen steadfast, and we see that Syria is not turning out so well for those who support Al Qaeda. And a burden has been lifted off the shoulders of the Iranians. Iran has been giving Syria free oil and helping it alongside the Russians and the Iraqis, and I think the Algerians. Well, now uh, those countries that have helped destroy Syria, and they have destroyed Syria. Mr. Erdogan will be remembered in history as someone who murdered hundreds of thousands of Syrians in his dirty war. And so will Qatar, and so will all those countries that funded Al Qaeda and ISIS and the others, and the Israeli regime and the Europeans and the Jordanian regime. They'll all be remembered for doing this. What Tulsi Gabbard said is just the beginning of this exposure. It will come out more in future, and these people will be remembered for what they did. But in any case, the burden is on their shoulders now. Now they're the ones who are going to have to pay for Syria, and it's going to be much more costly than before because the country is in utter chaos, because the bureaucracy has fallen apart, because the infrastructure has been destroyed and the Israelis have been bombing it and destroying it and taking key parts of the country. And because Al Qaeda has just made people angry, and we see people rising up in different parts of the country. So these countries are going to have to, this is going to be a huge burden for them. And I don't think they're going to be successful. So I think that the axis of resistance today is very strong, and it will grow stronger. And the Israeli regime and the West, as they continue, the West as it continues to confront the Russians, and the United States has foolishly, under Trump, refrained from taking the right steps to end the war in Ukraine. They are, it's as we expected, though. I didn't think that Trump would move swiftly to end this this horrible war. So the people of Ukraine are going to continue to pay the price, but this is going to be a burden for the West. Every day that this war continues, it's a heavy cost for the West. Just like, remember, after the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, after the occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, they were saying that the United States has wasted $6 or $7 trillion. I think in 2017, 16, Trump himself said that. So one of your viewers can look this up and correct me about the date. The war in Ukraine is much more costly. It's not just a direct cost, because people talk about how much the United States has sent to Ukraine or how much the Europeans. That's just a fraction of the cost. The refugees, the end of Russian cheap gas and cheap energy, the lack of trade between Russia and West. These are trillions of dollars of damage. These have brought trillions of dollars of damage brought about, and it will only continue to get worse. So this is going to weaken the West further, greater confrontation with China. We saw how the United States was gloating about its AI capabilities and how no one can compete with it. And the Chinese pulled the rug from under all these AI companies. The United States is not in a good position. And so Iran, the resistance, BRICS, these are entities that will continue to grow. And again, I don't see a near future that's going to be wonderful for the global South, but the shift away from the West, the shift in the globe is, and the shift away from the West, or the power shift away from the West, is going to continue. And BRICS and Iran and the resistance are going to benefit from that.
Indeed, Professor Marandi. We just have two questions I wanted to get to from the audience. The first, I just want to thank the person, Monzer Chahab, for their generous super chat donation. They asked this question outside of the super chat donation, though. And while I think this question can be quite sensitive, of course, for you, Professor Marandi, I do want to ask you in your own, in your own words. This viewer asked, what are the divisions in Iranian society? You can answer that however you like. If the first thing that came to mind was, there is an Iran-based opposition that even today I see spewing their part of the nuclear lies, the 1,800-mile radius facility that's creating weapons that can reach Europe. But I'll let you answer the question.
Well, this so-called opposition that's in the West, they are heavily funded by USAID and other entities. So they get their money. Now some of them are in deep trouble because of Trump pulling the plug for whatever reason. But they are funded by the West. And then they put out propaganda, and the West carries out policy based on that propaganda. So it's a cycle. They pay for them. They say what needs to be said, and policy is devised based upon the nonsense that these people produce. But they're not important for inside Iran. But what is interesting is that in the West, when they speak about Iran and they speak about the divisions in Iran, in the West, when they speak about divisions, they say, "Oh, this is open society. There's debate. There are checks and balances." But when it's Iran, it's division. The country is falling apart. The people are against each other. So the same thing in the West is presented in a positive way, but in Iran is presented in a very negative way. The fact is that in Iran, there's much more freedom, and again, many of your viewers will be skeptical, I have no doubt. But in many ways, there's much more freedom in Iran than in the West. Which mainstream media outlet in the West has been saying anything against the Israeli regime in a significant way over the last 16 months, or against the war in Ukraine? The mainstream media, the legacy media, they've been all supporting these wars. In Iran, when Syria fell, there are telegram channels, newspapers, websites, and political parties and entities that welcome the fall of President Assad. They're completely opposed to the government, the state policy on Syria. Many of them, many of these people oppose the resistance. Many of them said it's great that Assad fell, and that this is just the same narrative as the West. The very same narrative that you see on CNN or on the BBC. They're repeated by these liberals who have websites and who have very powerful media in the country. But you don't see that in the West. You only see it in alternative media. But these are very mainstream media. Some of them are very closely associated with senior political parties or political players. So the criticism of the state, of the guards, of the leader, of Iran's policies in the region, in Gaza, with regards to the United States is very sharp. But the narrative about Iran in the West is that this is like some sort of despotic regime which controls the people, and people are being battered on the streets and no one can say anything. That's nonsense. But that's the narrative, and it's been going on for so many years, for over 4 decades, that even when they confront truth, it still doesn't change the narrative. Even when the truth sometimes hits them, it still doesn't change, doesn't create a rethink. But what I would advise your viewers to do, although your viewers are politically aware and they're not like ordinary people, well, what I would advise them to do is just to look at the last 16 months. Iran, this terrible, evil country that's, killing its own people, and that's, incompetent and corrupt and everyone hates it. This country has been supporting the axis of resistance, paying a huge price. And on the other side of the battlefield is the whole of NATO, alongside Australia and Switzerland and New Zealand and others, and regional countries that are doing business with the Israelis, who are supporting or facilitating or at least allowing this genocide to happen. So who has the moral high ground here?
Yes, and just one final question for you then, Professor Marty, from the audience and I won't pull it up on the screen. Unfortunately, Nagia had this question just because if you literally put 10 and 7 together, this is how ridiculous it's become on YouTube. You could very well get censored. And I want to make sure Professor Marandi's answer is viewable for those who are watching now and for later. So their question is from Nagia. Is Hamas moments of October 7th the same as the Vietnam Tet Offensive of 1968? Military losses, but it raised global media attention.
There are parallels, without a doubt. Although here, I think Hamas can claim that they won militarily, and in that offensive, the Americans can say they beat them back, but it was the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War, because for the first time, ordinary Americans were seeing that the narrative of the media was a lie, that they were winning, and clearly they were not. So here, I think actually the victory of Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the axis of resistance was much more clear cut than what happened at that time in Vietnam. But I think there are parallels that exist between the two.
Yeah, and I just want to close. You can, of course, have a final reaction for us, Marandi. You know, from the very beginning when Israel began this genocidal onslaught, I wasn't unhappy that people were following it as well. You know, this is horrific for the Palestinians. People, all should, and we should continue to do that because the conditions are still horrible for the Palestinian people. There's still conditions of genocide. Life expectancy has been halved. That is horrific. But from the very outset, when I saw Israel do this, when it dipped its military footprint into and its expansionist and colonialist footprint into the waters of genocide, immediately my first reaction was, well, this is something that is likely to backfire quite dramatically because we have a long, and this is why I believe in geopolitics, we have to have an understanding of history. We have a long history of colonialist, settler regimes over the course of history, especially in the West, that have done something very similar, and they've all ended up having to pack up and go to some extent. And we are also in a much different world now where this kind of historical moment and a war crime is one that doesn't necessarily support the conditions in the world right now. It does feel outdated, and I think what we've seen actually is that the history of resistance has just been written again, and we are going to continue to see that up until the point of Israel's collapse and the United States' full ouster from West Asia. However, that is to come, because I believe that will have an internal component in the United States as well. Just as we've been talking about the examples of Vietnam, the resistance of Vietnam was very heroic, but also there was a lot of opposition to it. I believe similar dynamics are on the way for the United States' own domination. So, any final thoughts to that? Because I feel like we talk a lot about resistance here, in part because I believe it's so important to understand that a genocide is a horrific crime, and Israel needs to be held accountable. The United States needs to be held accountable. But if we don't understand how taking such an action has both that horrific element to it, as well as that perhaps unwise element for a regime like Israel's, then we miss the full picture.
I think that in today, while I don't know if genocide and Holocaust are outdated, I think that uh, the human being is the human being, and we're always going to have, at least under current circumstances, these same tendencies, but or these same sort of genocidal monsters who will try to do what has been done in the past and what we're seeing happening today in Palestine and in Lebanon and the region. We'll see. I think that's something that we should be worried about in the future as well. The very fact that these people talk about nuclear weapons shows that they're willing to do monstrous things that have rarely been done before. But what has changed, I think, for sure, is the fact that the world is much more interconnected. And so we see what's happening. You know, just a couple of days ago, someone was asking me about China and how about rights there. I said, you know, people in China have smartphones. If anything similar to what's been going on in Lebanon and in Gaza and the West Bank and in Syria, if that was happening in China, we would know about it. But the world sees that the West is the one that's carrying out the bulk of the atrocities, not anyone else. And in Syria, I mean, even in Syria, I was no fan of the Ba'athist Party ever, and neither was Iran. Even though, as I said, Iran supported it in the face of Israel, in the face of the United States, in the face of ISIS and Al Qaeda. But now you see images coming out from Syria that you didn't see before. Whatever, regardless of what the Ba'athist was. Right now, you see every day, you see people being executed, people being beheaded, people being battered and beaten. And the West is pretending that everything is fine in Syria, but things are obviously very, very, very bad and deteriorating. So with social media, although censorship I think is on the rise, but with social media, and I'm not saying that Iran is utopian, and Iran has its own censorship, Iran has its own problems. But again, I'm talking about the fact that the bulk of the atrocities that are being committed in the world are being carried out by the West, not by China, not by Russia, not by Iran, not by anyone else. But since the world is interconnected, people are seeing it. We heard about Vietnam in history books. Maybe there are a few photos and a few clips that we saw. Now we wake up with new images of slaughter. We go after lunch. We check social media. We see more footage of slaughter and massacre. In the evening, the same. We go to bed and it's the same. The world has changed, so it makes it much more difficult for people to carry out these atrocities and get away with it. And that has helped to bring about awakening. But complacency is something that we should be very, very fearful of, especially in the coming days and weeks and months ahead for the Palestinian people. And as we speak, the Israeli regime is intensifying its atrocities in the West Bank. And also people in Gaza are dying because of disease and so on. And in Lebanon, there is the threat of war. And as I said, when the people went and took back their land, the Israelis murdered ordinary people. 6 women, I think, were murdered. A child was murdered. We have to keep reminding people and keep active on social media, even though we're shadow banned. But we have to keep pushing to make sure that the pressure is maintained on these Western regimes, so that we can have a better future for the people in Palestine and for the people of our region.
Yes, and that's why I like to have you on the show, Professor Marandi. I do want to clarify when I said outdated, just for the audience. I meant in terms of genocide and expansionism, especially settler like expansionism and colonialism. I meant not that it's not going to happen or continue to happen for as long as regimes like Israel exist.
Hopefully, it'll be outdated. Hopefully,
Yes,
it is outdated.
yes,
We
yeah,
have to
yeah.
make sure it remains outdated.
But even today, what I meant though is that uh, at this time in this era that we live in, unlike, let's say, the United States, a settler regime. I mean, it started out as a settler regime. I introduced this program with the example of the 1637 massacre of the Pequot tribes in what is now Connecticut. And at that time, that led to very tangible developments, which led to the United States becoming a quote unquote successful empire, even if it's on the backs of a bloody, militarist and extremely exploitative and violent regime. Now, though, we have Israel and, of course, Washington backing it, this dip into genocide, I believe, has proven that this whole greater Israel project, this idea that Israel is just going to expand without any limits, that it's going to be able to rule over the region without any challenges, and that it is going to live in perpetuity and have a similar history to the United States, for example. I think that is what is outdated, that there is no way a regime like Israel can make almost itself to be a mini United States where it just can live in perpetuity for as long as as long as possible. It seems like its history is now being written as the final chapter rather than simply the expanding volume, so to speak. So if you have any thoughts to that, Professor Marandi, please give them, and then we can wrap up here.
I agree completely. I think that that is what we're seeing today. This is the last chapter of Zionism, but I don't know how long this chapter will be. And hopefully, it will not be too long, and that it will end well for Jews, Christians, Muslims, and others who just want to live together in peace in Palestine.
Yes, and everyone, before you leave here today, be sure to hit the like button because that helps boost this stream after we all depart here. Of course, many thanks to Professor Marandi for joining me today. I will be back on Tuesday, February 4th, with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and Andrei Martyanov. We're going to go back to the entire global situation, Trump, what is next in terms of foreign policy. That begins at 2 p.m. Eastern on February 4th. And then on the 5th, I'll have a big panel. I'll let you know the details of that. But without further ado, everybody, thank you so much. Of course, thanks again to Professor Mohammad Marandi for being my guest today. Hit the like button before you go. Go to the video description for all the places to support this work, Patreon, Substack, and much more. Thanks to all the moderators for doing great work moderating the chat. And thank you, of course. I put them all up on the screen to everyone who gave a super chat, super thanks, super sticker. It is very much appreciated. It is the beginning of the month, so every donation is very much appreciated. Subscribe on Patreon and or Substack if you want to become a monthly ongoing member. You can also sign up on YouTube too. Without further ado, everyone, take care and have a good rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.